Hello, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Yat shikedo shidene she korina sabiku yenishe tachini nishle watlana bashishtin tohuglini dashiche ima idishgijni dashinele. Good afternoon, my friends and relatives. My name is Corina Sabicu. I am Dene and Jemez Pueblo. I am from the Red Running into the Water Clan, born from many Hogons, and I'm a senior research program coordinator under the Center for Health Equity and Community Engaged Research. I am located here at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. I'd like to welcome you all to the Indigenous Health Topics Speaker Series. As part of our center's Native American community outreach efforts to engage tribal health, we host this event, which is focused on hosting speakers who are local, regional, and national experts in health, education, and research. These presentations are focused on topics that have an impact on our Native American Alaska Native communities. All of our presentations are recorded and posted on our internal and external websites. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today to listen and learn. So before we get started, I want to go through a few housekeeping items. So we will have time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. Please add all of your questions to the Q&A and we will get to them at the end of our presentation. All right, so our guest speaker today is Dr. Kyle Hill. He will be speaking on place-based determinants of Indigenous mental health, climate justice as an approach to wellness. Dr. Hill is Ojibwe, Turtle Mountain Band enrolled citizen, Dakota, Sisseton Wahpeton Sioux Tribe, Lakota Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe. Dr. Hill is currently an assistant professor with the University of North Dakota School of Medicine and Health Sciences, Department of Indigenous Health. Most recently, Dr. Hill completed his MPH through the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in 2020. He is active in community-based participatory research with American Indian and First Nations communities in the US and Canada, while also collaborating on research projects across social, behavioral, and environmental health within Native communities. In particular, his research interests consider the social, political, and ecological determinants of health, as well as climate justice and decolonizing health and wellness in Indigenous communities. He currently lives on his Dakota and Anishinaabe traditional homelands in St. Paul, Minnesota. So with that said, I will go ahead and hand it off to Dr. Hill.
Halmataki api, chante washte na pe choose apido, Kyle Hill maki api, petulutu hokshila miedo, amnesiaska, otue, sisitua wakpetua hemata. Good morning, relatives. I just did a introduction that I don't usually do. I usually do introduction in Anishinaabe, but I just today I found myself I'm actually in Haisapa, which is the Black Hills, right in Rapid City, South Dakota. This is actually where I was born. It's a very special place for our Ocheti Shakoi communities, being Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota communities. I just wanted to introduce myself on that part of myself, but as Sabrina mentioned, I'm make my home in St. Paul, which is kind of our territorial homelands for our Dakota peoples and our Anishinaabe peoples. And very excited to be with you here today. I'm going to just get started and share my presentation. And let's see here, share, and let's pull up the presentation. That's not it. I'm sorry. Apparently there's another PowerPoint I had opened. Hold on one second here. All right, perfect. So we're gonna start the slideshow. Wait. This is in the middle of the slideshow, so you want to start it at the beginning. All right. Okay, so thank you for bearing with me. We're just going to go ahead and get started here. So yeah, today I'm presenting a talk on place-based determinants of Indigenous mental health, considering climate justice as an approach to wellness. This work is very important to me as I graduated with a Ph.D. in clinical psychology in 2013 and did a postdoc at the Center for Indigenous Health at Johns Hopkins, and then went into clinical practice for a term of a service obligation to the Indian Health Service. And from my own experiences and those of our community members that I served, what I noticed even in clinical work was that many of us as Indigenous people struggle with identity. In addition to that, we struggle with kind of relationship to our homelands. And, within that, embedded within that relationship to homelands is considerations of spirituality, cultural identity, and the like. And so once I went back for my MPH, took courses in climate change and indigenous and health, climate change and mental health, environmental health, biological, public health, biology. I started to realize that a lot of that disconnection we were experiencing was also being threatened by climate change. So Indigenous peoples, in short, from my experience and from what I was seeing, we were witnessing a environmental shift that was threatening our ways of life, our cultures, our traditions, our spiritual connectedness to our homelands, while at the same time grieving a disconnection that was forced by way of colonization of our homelands and territories. And in the United States and Canada, what that looked like was more or less the westward expansion, right? Doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny, essentially the right to expand at the expense of occupancy is what they called that. And so in my talk today, I'll be reflecting a lot on these periods of colonization, the forced assimilation and acculturation of our peoples as principal threats to that connection to our lands as a place-based determinant of Indigenous mental health. So I'll move forward. Again, as I usually do my presentations from my home office as a remote faculty member, but this is a map done by a really gifted artist. Her name is Marlena Miles, who is Dakota herself. But this is the traditional names in the traditional map of St. Paul, which is Amnesia Otue, and Minneapolis, which is known as Bede Otue. And so you can see you have the Mississippi River or Wakapatonka and the Minnesota rivers. And then in the center of the map, you'll see a place called Bedote, which is a sacred place for us as Dakota people. But since at least I've lived there, and I'm sure for many years, it's known as Pike Island now. And I want to say it's, a state regulated park or something like that. And so I'm going to be sharing stories throughout my talk today, but one in particular that is very close to what I would consider my own kind of evolution into this work and my own evolution as an Indigenous person, and my own reconnection to my homelands. We just had a baby girl. She's my daughter, Miss Guades, is 7 months old now. And, for a long time, I've known that this place, Bedote, is sacred for our peoples. And when my daughter was born, we asked if we could have the placenta back, because in Ojibwe or in Anishinaabe ways, and I'm sure in Dakota, Lakota ways too, we use that, or we thought, let's bury it, kind of return it to the land as a way of saying, thank you for the nurturing our daughter. Thank you for being a life giver and for helping us bring her into this world. And so it just dawned on us, maybe the best place to do this, because we were thinking, oh, can we bury it in our backyard? And we were like, no, that'd be kind of weird, because maybe we'll move after a few years and then we'll go to this strange house and be like, that's where your placenta is buried. And so that didn't seem like the place to do it. So it just kind of came to us. It just so naturally and organically, we were like, let's bury it at Budote. And so, we had the placenta, and our baby was, less than a week old. And we're scared parents. This is our first child. We're scared parents putting her in the carrier, number one. And then two, my partner's like, I don't want you to bring a shovel with our new baby, and we're walking through this state park, and there's lots of people looking at us, and it's super awkward, but there was something important for us to do. And so we went through that Fort Snelling State Park, and we crossed into Budote, or Pike Island. And we walked around, and we found a big tree. And right at the kind of confluence of those two rivers, we sat and we said a prayer, and we offered a sema, or tobacco, and we buried our placenta right under a tree. And that's the way we felt that we could honor that placenta and the life-giving power that it provided us. And not too recently, a friend of ours was a researcher who provided major contributions to the Truth Report for the University of Minnesota as a land grant university. And going through that research, what she had found, in talking to community members and going into archives, was that historically Budote was a place where Dakota families and Dakota women gave birth. And so that was a place where we did that historically. And I can't tell you the overwhelming emotions that came to me when we talk about ancestral wisdom and blood memory and things like that. This struck me to my core. And so I wanted to just open with that story to just help you understand the intimate connection that we have to place, that we have to our territorial homelands as Indigenous people. And even though our place names are different now, they're in English, or our plant medicine or plant relatives are in Latin, those are still our relatives, and we still have a strong connection with them, even though we might not feel it or might not think of it that way. So this is just as a introduction. This is my family, and there's many more family members. Well, that's my partner. That's my little baby on the lower left there. That was her first time touching the ocean, and we were so excited for her. And then that's me and a really good friend at a powwow. So I do grass dancing, and it's my mom, and that was us parching and winnowing wild rice on the top, or monomen on the top right. And so that's a tradition that we're trying to get going on an annual basis for our family too. And so just an overview of the talk. So I'll be talking about the significance of place to our American Indian Alaska Native communities and Indigenous communities more broadly, but I'm going to try to focus it on American Indian Alaska Native. impacts of settler colonialism on our sense of place as American Indian Alaska Native peoples. And of course, just briefly visit the impacts of our contemporary health inequities within our communities. And then climate change and associated risks to American Indian Alaska Native communities, the vulnerabilities associated with climate change, and the impacts on mental health as we know them at this time. And finally, I'll be wrapping up with really more like principles of climate justice and how we can recognize Indigenous communities in this work. And really utilize these very powerful and the utility of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges in looking at things like climate adaptation, climate mitigation, for us all to have healthier environments, which is, coincidentally also has a huge impact on promoting our mental health and our own physical wellness, spiritual wellness, and emotional health. And so when you think about place, whether it's Rochester, the Twin Cities, or any other place up there, we know them more intimately as Anishinaabe Aki or Dakota Makoche, which is essentially like Anishinaabe lands, earth, and Dakota lands are earth. And in fact, the term Indigenous itself means the original occupants of ancestral lands or place. And so when we recognize Indigenous people for any reason, we have to understand that they share a very intimate relationship with place. And they've also been displaced or dispossessed of lands due to settler colonialism. And so, some recent numbers, there's more than 370 million people who identify as Indigenous and have land tenure rights over about a quarter of the Earth's surface, with as many as 4,000 languages, and we can think of like American Indian Alaska Native communities just in and of themselves, with the 574 are federally recognized tribes. Like there's more than 300 languages, even just here in the United States. And so relationship with place kind of provides a foundation for our belief systems, our life ways, our identity, our Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges, our cultures, and our spirituality. And so there's an attachment to place, and place provides meaning to who we are as a peoples, as a group, as a collective, and as nations. Although, histories of injustice, genocide, and ethnic cleansing have been disruptive to Indigenous community sense of place. There's been forced removals and resettlements, and we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. Forced acculturation and assimilation, land dispossession on scales that are almost incomprehensible. Boarding school and residential school that essentially forced parents and families to give up their children for rations, for food, right? Essentially, there was threats by the federal government and authorities within the federal government that said, if you don't give up your kids, you're not going to get rations, right? You're not going to get your food rations. And so, furthermore, Indigenous communities pretty generally share deep, interconnected, and spiritual relationships to their territorial homelands. I think my story as an introduction kind of gave voice to that, and this guides lifeways, traditional and cultural activities. It's a basis for a way of knowing our epistemologies. In particular, the way that we connect with the earth and our ecosystems is really guided by our ceremonies and spiritualities and the corresponding ways that we understand how we exist as Indigenous peoples. I could say that most, if not all, of the tribal communities that I've come into contact with or have shared meals with or visited or have done work within, they all have their own creation stories. You know, they all have spiritual guides, and they look to certain animals or sacred places, whether it's mountains or waterways or it's either plant relatives or the air or the sky or clouds as really helping to guide them and provide not only purpose but an identity to their peoples as a collective. And certainly our livelihoods and wellness is associated with land-based activities like hunting and fishing and foraging, sustainable farming practices, gardening, and land and water management practices. And as I learn more about this work, I'm amazed by the technological advancements of the land and water management practices of Indigenous peoples, the way that our calendars were able to communicate to us the appropriate times to plant, you know, the appropriate times to harvest, the appropriate times, you know, to do all of these things that are just like, so it gives you an idea of how not only we were guided by like our environments, but also we were guided by our the cosmologies, right? And I like to think of like, you know, this might be a strange like point, but I think like Moana, like a lot of our kids love Moana, but I'm like, those communities were like so innovative, like with their direction from the stars. It's just so beautiful. And so for us, like constellations told us when to plant, you know, and so we had that star knowledge too. We have. And then the natural environment and ecosystems are considered like are very close relatives, and they all have spirits, right? There's a spiritual valence to our rocks, which we consider like our oldest relatives. Like those are the elders, you know, for us. And also like the moon, we have a very strong connection to the moon, and certainly femininity is very strongly connected to the moon. And then naturally the human and non-human worlds exist in harmony and balance. And I think most of all, when I think about ethics and research and the ways that we conduct ourselves accordingly, when we understand this and we think in this perspective and take this lens, accountability and responsibility for these relationships becomes paramount. So what would that look like if we thought about not only like our immediate or nuclear family, not only our extended family, but we thought of our ecosystems as like our close relatives? What does accountability and responsibility look like at that point, you know? So those are things to consider. And then next, these are just some pictures of, you know, this is us harvesting wild rice, or manumanike as we call it. And I'll talk a bit about that more later, but this is, when you talk about like the traditional stories of our Anishinaabe communities, our migration story basically said, you know, we migrated from the East Coast to the Great Lakes region, and if we're told, like, you know, where you stop is where food grows on water. So naturally, you know, when we think about Monoman, or which is essentially like called the good berry, it's food that grows on water, wild rice, very nutrient dense. It's a really powerful food for us, and it's a really awesome like traditional cultural activity to engage in on an annual basis. And then the middle picture here is a young relative of ours that was at Standing Rock at the No DAPL protests and the resistance camps, and he's holding a sign that says "Honor the treaties," because if you could remember, or if anyone had heard of this, the Dakota Access Pipeline, the route went directly through 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty territories, but because that treaty had been abrogated by the federal government, that those territories shrunk, and so it hadn't, there wasn't any meaningful consultation. There certainly wasn't an approval from the tribes that the treaty lands would shrink, and this is consistent with most treaties of our communities today. And then finally, the last treaty, or the last picture here, is of Kichigami, which is our Lake Superior, the largest freshwater lake in the world. And this is I think it's at Teteguchi State Park. So anyone can go up there. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. So just wanted to add that picture. And so this picture was part of like a creative resistance work at COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. So I was fortunate enough to go as like a small delegation, but we want to recognize the contributions to climate change of colonialism, and in particular the Industrial Revolution, the extractive industries, and here in Hesapo or the Black Hills, like gold mining or other kinds of copper mining, and Lake Superior or that region, all of the mining, the extractive industry, the oil industry. So, but we want to go back a long time ago to dispossession, when our peoples were dispossessed of our lands at such a massive scale. Like I said, it's almost incomprehensible. So this is a map of American Indian Alaska Native land between 1776 and 1887. And so, as I said, the idea here was the doctrine of discovery, again, in westward expansion at the expense of occupancy. So as you can see, there's relatively little indigenous lands to the east of the Mississippi River. And if you look at other maps, you'll realize that there aren't any federally recognized tribes in many states east of the Mississippi River. And that includes like Indiana, Ohio, and it's so strange because when we think about like North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, there's so many tribes, in each of our states. So you start to get an understanding of how comprehensive, and for these architects of this colonial project, how comprehensive and how almost complete it was. And so, these are some of the things that were happening along that same time. The picture on the left here is an indiscriminate slaughter of buffalo, because the Lakota and Dakota and Plains tribes relied on this animal. And again, this animal is recognized as like a sacred spirit. It's called like Pate Oyate. So it's like this buffalo nation, this buffalo family. But we relied on this heavily for everything: tools, of course, sustenance, blankets, clothing, spiritual tools. And when they say like the whole buffalo was used, like the whole buffalo was used. And then here on the right is a flyer for how they would advertise the real estate available to settlers during this time, from the Department of the Interior. So this is a lot of Indian land. And so we could think of this as, during the treaties were signed, this land was being bought for, pennies on the dollar. And certainly as we look at real estate markets today and the affordability of homes and land, this should strike everyone, from an emotional place. So today, here's a recent map from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Again, these are the federally recognized tribes, and as you see up here, when we're at kind of, I'll take a guess here. I'll be looking at Minnesota right there. So all of our Dakota communities were moved all the way over here, right? That's where we're from in Siston. And I'm from Veblen or Haipa district. More communities were put down here and then all the way over here. So you could see that removal. And of course, we have a couple of tribes like right over here. When you think about Mdewakanton and Prairie Island Band of Dakota. And so, all right, I'm having trouble changing my slide here. All right. Oh, I didn't know that stayed. Let me try to clear. Oops. Undo. Okay. So I wanted to talk about this very briefly. This is a study that was done by Farrell and colleagues in 2021. And the title of this was to look at the effects of land dispossession and forced migration on Indigenous peoples in North America. And so as you'll see in the top right where I have it highlighted, when I say the land dispossession was almost complete and comprehensive, you can see that 98.9% of there was 98.9% of land dispossessed from American Indian and Alaska Native communities, an aggregate reduction in cumulative coextensive lands. And 42.1% of tribes from the historical period that have no recognized present day land base. And then the average size of a tribe's present day lands are only 2.6% compared to historical mapping and land area. And under that, I think, which is critical to understanding like how our relationship to our own homelands, in that sense of place, the average forced migration distance, again, these are forced removals from traditional homelands, was 239 kilometers. And the maximum forced migration distance was 2,774 kilometers. And so think about that. As we look at climate change having these very acute impacts on coastal communities, on other Indigenous communities, where the water levels or sea levels are rising and they're forced to move. Think about moving 2,774 kilometers away from where you presently lived, being forced to move that far, and at the very least 239 kilometers. And so down below, this is just to show, the historical mineral potential of these lands. Of course, present day heat, extreme heat has increased present day versus historically. Precipitation has decreased overall. and mineral value potential has decreased. And essentially, mineral value potential in this study was like oil and other minerals that were held within the ground. And of course, that was part of the I think the decree for that manifest destiny and doctrine of discovery, right? Certainly, as I sit here in the Black Hills, the Lakota people did not sign over the Black Hills. The federal government tried to buy the Black Hills. The Lakota people said no. So the Black Hills, as an example, was stolen and continues to be stolen land. There is no legitimate right for anybody but the Lakota people to be in the Black Hills. So there's a lot of work going to recognize that, like in the movement that we can call the land back movement. That's a big part of it. There's so many aspects of it, and so that's a really important study that they did 2 years ago now. And so currently, when we think about social determinants of health, within the US and Canada, Indigenous communities, there's lower life expectancies compared to non-Indigenous populations, higher unemployment rates, lower incomes, and poor educational attainment of high school diplomas. And then health inequities in terms of mental health, PTSD and traumatic stress disorders, of course, is a higher prevalence in American Indian communities, anxiety disorders, some depressive disorders and substance use disorders, and suicide for our younger communities. And then for physical health and comorbidities, diabetes, there's disparities in diabetes, obesity, substance abuse, again, suicide, unintentional injuries. And a lot of the unintentional injuries are, I think people on the ground in the community recognize these as, subsequent to substance abuse or kind of even suicide attempts at times. And then, of course, cervical, kidney, and liver cancers. But I think a caveat here is that despite how these disparities exist, what they look like, much of these you can find in the Indian Health Service 2014 IHS Trends Manual. But we have to, I guess, recognize that there's tremendous heterogeneity between and within tribal nations. And I really learned that when I was doing work with suicide prevention with communities. Some communities are as high as, historically, as high as like 13 or 14 times their other US racial counterparts. And some communities are much lower than that. And so I think most importantly here for this talk and recognizing the power and importance of place is that positive mental health and resilience is associated with connection to place, environment, spirituality, cultural and traditional activities, right? So I think we, in a very simple way, we can recognize that the things that were forcibly taken and removed through this, colonial project, there was a reason for that, because it was the power that we held. It was the love that we shared, right? It was the spirit that we embodied as a collective peoples. And so, of course, if in the architecture of this, that's what you're going to terminate. That's what you're going to target, right? And so here we are, 2023, we're looking at strengths-based approaches to promote the health and wellness of American Indian, Alaska Native, and other Indigenous communities. This is what we target. This is how you develop a strengths-based approach to public health work that we do, whether it's prevention research, whether it's intervention focus, whether it's translational research or evaluation. You know, tribes and communities are done with deficit-based research and work, right? Because we understand that the disparities are out there. We want promotional, like positive health approaches, and that focus on our wellness. And so, so some of the work that we have going on is related to our connection to our lands and the way that our cultures, our spirituality, and our languages help facilitate wellness in that relationship. And so there's some ongoing work with tribal communities that you know, it's in tribal review right now, so I don't have the authority to talk about it much out of respect for our tribal partners. But we're seeing some cool results. You know, there's some positive relationships with positive mental health and flourishing that's coming from the practice and engagement and what we term Indigenous eco-relational engagement, which is the place-based spiritual, cultural, traditional activities and language. Because language is place-based. And I think when we consider the amount of languages we talked about earlier, you know, more than 300 languages in the US for American Indian Alaska Native communities, we have to think of the more than, I want to say it's 574 tribes, federally recognized tribes, that language comes from the place. You know, it's often animate, and it often comes from those ecosystems, right? Particularly like our Ojibwe language, I want to say. And then let me see, and this promotes earlier work that we had done on language and similar tribes. And so for climate risk, you know, the call for justice, again, we can think of something as simple as like land back. And I think that's a huge kind of way of saying like land back is like everything, you know, it's languages, it's our children, our sovereignty, it's our education, it's the places that we are and that we can exist freely and liberated, right? So in relation to climate change, frameworks for climate-related health impacts recognize Indigenous communities at risk due to our dependence on land, our interdependence, our traditional lifestyles, our culture and food systems. And a lot of times, a lot of our tribes face food and water insecurity today. You know, whether that was, you know, I think about some tribal communities experience some damming of their waterways from like the US Army Corps of Engineers that really impacted their ability to live according to their traditional life ways. And kind of in our region and other like Arctic regions too, we see some climate-related risks associated with like melting sea ice, rising air temperatures and surface water temperatures, extreme precipitation events, flooding is one that we see fairly often. Smaller average winter ice extents are problematic in Minnesota, and I have a couple slides that kind of show that. But when we think about climate justice or the justice-oriented framework for adapting and mitigating climate change, as well as promoting wellness for our Indigenous communities, we have to look to our traditional knowledge systems and original instructions to really help to mitigate and adapt, right? And in many ways, what's being written about now, or the way it's been written, is it's a term called Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges. So it's a really beautiful way to, you know, to both affect change. Oh, sorry. I don't know if you can hear that. I try to play that all the time and people can't hear it, but it's a really beautiful song that these kids were singing as we were harvesting wild rice a couple years ago. The Anthropocene is essentially thinking about our era of climate change as human-induced. We can trace back, whether it's the Industrial Revolution, moving forward, the changes in global warming, the changes to our ecosystems, and certainly the causes of the causal kind of relationship of pollution to some of our waterways. But the population seemed to be particular risk of adverse consequences of global warming of 1.5 Celsius and beyond, which is what we're trying to keep below. But recent evidence suggests that we might be at 1.5 Celsius by 2027, but certainly by 2050, that's kind of a really important timeline to look at, to be able to keep our global warming below 1.5 to 2.0 Celsius. But the vulnerable populations are disadvantaged and vulnerable as we are. We think about communities that struggle with social determinants, Indigenous peoples, local communities that are dependent on agricultural or coastal livelihoods, marginalized groups based upon social and environmentally mediated factors. Communities that have disabilities or that experience disabilities are another vulnerable group, as well as elders and youth. And so blueberries and birch bark, because I had heard one time that someone said, you're in Anishinaabe territory if you see three things: birch bark, blueberries, and monomen are food on the water. And so that was just a really signal to me that how I can find my way home, essentially. That's what home is. But it also made me reflect, as I'm doing this work, on how Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges reflect that deeply embedded interconnectedness with our natural ecosystems, and also like our ways of knowing, our sense of place, and the importance, the affinity, the connection to place, and our sense of belonging, right? And again, this is increasingly cited as critical to climate adaptation and mitigation. And recently, the White House put out a memorandum and press release to kind of lift up or amplify Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges in the Office of Technology and other agencies as we adapt to the environmental shifts related to climate change. But here, I think it's important to recognize that, Indigenous communities caretake for about like 80% of biodiversity, despite only inhabiting about 22% of the Earth's surface, and only representing about 5% of the Earth's population, right? So you see that these knowledges and the ability to caretake for and steward these lands is still embedded within these communities, despite the attempts of this colonial project to disrupt or disconnect us, or quite honestly, to terminate or destroy us in that relationship. And so we're still here. The Indigenous communities are still taking care of their lands because, this is who we are. This is who we are. We are the land, and the land is us. And again, positive mental health and resilience is associated with connection to place, environment, spirituality, and traditional activities. And so This is a map of the Great Lakes, and so this is the summer surface water temperature and trends in year. You can see this is like a thermal map, and you see that the surface water temperature is increasing year over year from 1994 to 2013. And so the greatest rates of change occurred in deeper water, with smaller increases occurring near shorelines. But I think this is kind of a signal to us about what's to come, especially when we consider the traditional stories related to Lake Superior for Anishinaabe communities, and also the importance of our waterways. Where for climate change in particular, with the rise in water temperature, we see kind of a rise in illnesses, the rise in inhabitability for many of the biodiverse, fish that we see, other kind of organisms, and at like a very microscopic level, and an increase in waterborne illnesses, of course. And so this is just, some kind of a locally recognize changes that are occurring. And then here's ice cover duration. And so you see the trend in days per year for the duration of seasonal ice cover is decreasing in most areas of the Great Lakes. And again, this is between 1973 and 2013. So the rate of change in ice cover duration is seen kind of near shorelines, with smaller rates occurring in deeper central parts of the lakes. And some of you, if you travel to Duluth, at least, somewhat frequently, might see this during the winter and stuff like that, that the ice cover doesn't go as far off of the shoreline. And so here we are, the effects of climate change on mental health for our communities. And so when we think about the environmental shifts that have occurred, the impact of this assimilation, forced acculturation, forced removals, and forced land dispossession. But these ecological systems change have impacts on grief and mourning, right? And so one author, Ashley Consolo, coined this term of ecological grief with their work in the Arctic with Inuit communities. And so essentially ecological grief is grief felt in relation to experienced or anticipated ecological losses, including loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to acute or chronic environmental change. And this could be grief of physical ecological loss. Maybe it's again, as we saw earlier, maybe it's the decreased duration of ice extent in the communities. Maybe it's the water temperature that's affecting, where the fish spawn, how deep fish go, and their likelihood of being present at a certain time when the tribal communities were counting on that, right, for their livelihoods. And in many ways, it's disruption to knowledge or identity, right? What does it mean when you can't count on this certain sustenance, or this certain whatever it is, fish, deer, any type of animal that you're used to eating in your traditional food systems doesn't appear anymore. It's not there in abundance like it used to be, right? And then there's anticipated loss associated with this. And then, of course, in the literature, extreme weather events and acute direct impacts of climate change and loss of ecosystems can trigger things like PTSD and vicarious trauma, major depressive disorder, anxiety, and certainly eco-anxiety, though that's less studied within Indigenous communities. Complicated grief reactions and general distress, survivor guilt, if you're thinking about maybe tsunamis or floods or wildfires where other communities may have not have made it, and then you're surviving and you're asking yourself why, why me? Substance abuse and suicidal ideation. And I think reading this work by Consolo and Ellis, they did some qualitative work when they were developing this term, ecological grief, and they were working with the Inuit communities in the Arctic, and one of the participants said, "Inuit are people of the sea ice. If there's no more sea ice, like how can we be people of the sea ice?" And that's a very like simplistic notion for anybody that's non-Indigenous to think about. Yeah, well, I don't know. But within that, we have to realize that there's creation stories there. There's livelihoods that have spanned the course of generations, time immemorial, that have crossed the sea ice, that have lived with the sea ice in these communities. Whether it's harvesting seal or harvesting whatever it is, that those communities do, the sea ice has been that they've shared a relationship with it. They know it, to be able to cross it, to bore inside of it, to use an auger or whatever they do. But that's their identity. And so it's a disruption of the sense of place and connection to land. And then there's a corresponding kind of loss or fear of loss of environmental knowledge and identity that you see deep embedded within that quote. And of course, our identities, as we know them, are constructed in relationship to the land, its use and knowledge of it. And so we can ascertain that this probably would disproportionately affect Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers, the people that are closest to the land that we would go to learn how to forage, to learn how to garden, to learn how to how to hunt and do these things that we're all trying to get back to. And then there's findings in papers that suggest that even adolescents think about historical loss as much or more than their caretakers, loss of traditional lands, loss of culture. And that's related to kind of depressed affect. And so as I'm moving towards closing here, and we talk about interdependence of land, our interconnectedness with land has been recognized as a planetary determinant of health. And we have to think about our Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges and the direct associations with land and sacred sites, right? For example, here in Hesapa, there's the Wing Cave, or as I've explained, the Manuman, or our lakes for the Anishinaabe. And these knowledge systems are kind of share narrative functions and they're intergenerationally transferred knowledge through our generations and communities. And often restorative and regenerative land-based healing practices that come from these knowledges are vital to our own health and adaptive capacity of Indigenous lands. And so I just wanted to include these. This is from a book by Eddie Benton Benet, which was published in 1979. So this is a really well-known traditional and ceremonial leader, and it just so happened to write a book that was illustrated kind of for children and adolescents, kind of middle grade. But it talks about the Ojibwe migration story from the East Coast. It talks about the 7 stopping points to food that grows on water. Manuminike, the practice of harvesting Manoman, and the actual calendar that guided us to be able to do this. And one of the months is Manuminike Gizis, or the wild rice moon. And then, of course, the sustainable practice and example of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in our region is, the practice of harvesting wild rice. And in fact, when we think about the life cycle of wild rice, in a large part, it's dependent on this relationship of humans harvesting it, because we actively, by harvesting it and missing it usually goes in the canoe, but inevitably some doesn't make it in, and all of those seeds go back and reseed these beds for the next year or subsequent years. So it's actually protective, and it helps cultivate the wild rice, just going out there and being on the water with it. And so these are the 7 stopping places along the St. Lawrence River from the East Coast that Anishinaabe communities took. And finally, just thinking about climate justice and resilience and principles of wellness and ways that Indigenous communities can really be strong contributors to adaptation to climate change and really on a global scale during this time. We have to think about articulating Indigenous conceptualizations on and approaches to health. And again, this is going back to this interconnectedness with our environments. What would that look like if we took that perspective and embodied that interconnectedness? How would we move? How would we behave? How would our lives be different? This is the principle that talks about. Number 2 is developing interdisciplinary collaborative approaches and active engagement with tribal communities to recognize Indigenous knowledges alongside Western scientific approaches. There has been folks that have developed a concept called two-eyed seeing that really, I think, is an embodiment of this ideal or this principle of co-constructing knowledge so that we could develop the most impactful and the most innovative approaches, putting like Western and Indigenous approaches together. And then leveraging and building on sociocultural strengths of Indigenous communities. Again, strengths-based approaches to wellness. This is going to catalyze and promote wellness at the greatest degree. It's really honoring tribal sovereignty, because that's what tribes want. That's what our communities want. We don't want any more deficit-based approaches, just focusing on deficits of our communities. And then, of course, developing strategies to affect change on root causes of the vulnerability, which is essentially looking at how can we develop approaches that promote health equity within our communities, because there's so many social and ecological determinants of health that undermine the health and resolve and resilience of American Indian Alaska Native communities. And then enhancing climate-related health risk management. And finally, developing strategies, policies, and programming that return land to Indigenous communities. And we're seeing that a lot now. Just recently, there was a co-administration kind of agreement between the U.S. and I think it was Bois Forte, Fond du Lac, and Grand Portage to care for the Superior National Forest. And I know there's been efforts, a lot of other tribes are doing this now. And that's really the huge, one of the most amazing thing that's coming from the Biden administration. There's so much money and resources going to tribes toward developing climate change adaptation and mitigation programs. And then here's just a model of health. I think that I just kind of drew this up as a conceptual model, and it's I just called it the kinship model of health that recognizes a lot of these principles and approaches. And you'll see the citation down at the bottom. I kind of borrowed a couple pieces from a paper that I helped write on sociocultural integration, holistic health among Indigenous young adults. But you see that sovereignty is from a socio-ecological perspective and framework, sovereignty is the biggest piece that we need to promote and make part of our projects, health interventions and prevention when we work with Indigenous communities. And we need to recognize that that kinship comes with the sovereignty, right? If we develop our approaches that honor tribal sovereignty, they're going to develop programs and approaches that are kind of consistent with that model of kinship that I talked about, thinking about the land as a relative and that interconnectedness as kind of central. And then spirituality, ceremony, languages and value development in our children, traditional and cultural engagement, community and Indigenous traditional ecological systems. Then, of course, within that medicine, we always say on the outside, that spiritual part of us, the physical, mental, and emotional aspects of us. And that is it. These are my references. And miigwech, Pidamia, I appreciate everybody's time. And this is us last year at the July 4th. This nonprofit my partner works with, the Indian Collective, where I'm actually sitting right now. They did this banner drop, which said land back on July 4th. And this is us kind of protesting on the streets, and I'm carrying the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe flag, which I was super proud to do. And then that's us at Awamni. You're on native land. So anyway, that's my talk. I really appreciate everybody listening. I'm gonna stop sharing. And yes, this is. Oh, hi, Sarah. I just saw Sarah from. Yeah, good to see you. I'm just looking at the. Yeah, I noticed that this was. I must have not saved it because there's like a couple slides that I changed, but this is like the unchanged one, but it still is good. Let me I do here. All right, cool. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, so we're actually going to move to another Zoom link for an informal Q&A session. So Guthrie's going to throw in the chat the link that we can all click on and join. And I just want to remind everyone to please complete our survey. It's a really quick survey just to provide feedback for any of our future Indigenous health topic presentations. And then also our next guest speaker will be on June 15th. But if you all can click on the Zoom link, we'll join you all there.